Representative J.J. Pickle of Texas. Your subcommittee recently did a study showing that some American businessmen are willing to launder money. Why?
Well, presumably because they don't want a record made of the cash transaction and, in effect, not paying the taxes on that as income. Years ago, the Congress passed a law that first made money laundering illegal. And then we amended it by Section 6050I that said that business must report these kind of cash transactions. And the law says that if any merchant or institution is receiving cash in excess of $10,000, that must be reported to the Internal Revenue Service. So we are asking the merchants, the business people of the country, to simply fill out a form that if someone comes and wants to buy a luxury item from them, that all they got to do is make a report of it, their name and their address, basic information. So we had some investigators go out the last couple of months into 9 different cities in 9 different states and offer to buy these items, Persian rugs and automobiles and condominiums, watches and that type of thing. And always said we'd want to pay in cash. That was the only way we'd have it. And we wanted to know, would that be reported? We would find out that they would take the cash and not report it. It was a rather shocking thing to realize that in 79 different businesses that the investigators went into, 76 said that they would take the cash and not report it. 76 out of 79 said, give me the cash and I'll not fill out this form.
Did that number surprise you, that many were willing to do it?
Not only surprised us, it has shocked us to realize that approximately 95% of the businesses in the country are willing to make a sale and not report it. Now you ask yourself, well, did they know it? Did they know the law? In most cases, they indicated that they knew there was a money laundering law. It had something to do with the drug traffic. But they would also go a step further to say that we think you could get around this law by giving us cashier checks or structuring the sale in a manner that they wouldn't have to make a record of it. In other words, they knew what the law was in most instances, but simply were willing to circumvent the law.
Now, do you assume that most of the money we're talking about here is money from illegal operations?
No, we can't assume that. We know that if an individual, a money launderer, go to a bank by virtue of the law we passed in Congress, they must make that report to the Internal Revenue Service. It's called a CTR, Currency Transaction Reform Act. They're doing that. They weren't doing it years ago, the banks, until we had a case up in Boston where the Justice Department brought a suit and got a conviction. And all at once, the banks and the savings loan found religion. They began to fill out these forms. Now, we're asking individuals to do that now to help their government to know. And we're not trying to keep them from involving in cash sales. But if they do over $10,000, and here's why we do it. If a person comes into you and say, I want to buy something for an automobile of $50,000, but I only pay it in cash, there is a presumption that that cash is coming from some source, perhaps hadn't paid tax on it, and that you're willing to take it as a sale and not pay tax on it. And you are then hurting all taxpayers when you do that. So that is really an invasion of the law. But merchants are willing to do it because I think it's just been the accepted thing to do. And nobody has followed out to change it. And so it was a shocking, it really is a disgrace that our businesses have allowed this to develop to this point.
Historically, at least when we hear about drug cases where this has come up before, we think of luxury items, as you mentioned, cars and watches and some other things. But when you talk about, I think it was an antique shop also was willing to do it, that kind of surprised me.
Well, antique items are usually expensive items, and many of them are over the $10,000 mark. But merchants are willing to say, give me the cash. It got so bad in some cases that they knew something about it. Give an example. Our investigators went into Atlanta, Georgia, at a jewelry store, I believe it was. And they said, yes, we can sell these items. We think we can work with you. They said, as a matter of fact, the Internal Revenue Service has been looking at some of our books, wondering if we are engaged in these kind of transactions. Says, actually, at this very minute, there's a couple of them in the back of our store now checking our books. And we don't, if you don't mind, he said, lower your voices just a little bit so they won't hear what we're talking about. Now he said, we can get around the law this way. Now that's shocking. So it's one of our members said it's the most shocking revelation that he has seen since his 12 to 15 years in the Congress.
Should I assume that you suspected this trend and that's why you did the study?
Yes, we knew that it was happening in the banking institutions, and we assumed that it was done. So we set out to find. We just simply ran a test. Now we didn't try to entrap anybody. We just simply went out to these merchants. We had two people, a man and a woman, good, capable investigators, and went in and said they want to buy all these items, and they looked at them and then they offered them the cash, or to give them the cash. No money was actually transacted. And the merchants would always say, well, either we can't do it, and as they get ready to leave, they said, but just a minute, I think we can help you work around your problem this way. So it seems to me like it's a sort of a accepted procedure that businesses are following, and that hurts everybody. And you say, well, are you really losing any money for these things? Well, our committee has given us figures based on some of the Internal Revenue estimates that we may be losing as much as $30 billion a year just by failure to pay taxes on these cash transactions.
Is the committee moving to correct that? What's the solution?
We have made some suggestions to at the hearing yesterday to the Internal Revenue Service and the Justice and the Treasury Department. We have given them 3 or 4 suggestions where we think corrections can be made. I think in general they are willing to endorse those changes, and they're also willing to make some investigations of their own. For instance, within the last month now, the Internal Revenue Service has devised a new form. The form we use now is 8300. And that's all the merchant's supposed to fill out. I've got an 8300 here. This is an 8300 form now. Just a simple form that says give me the name and the address and the amount of money that's involved and the name and address of the seller. That's about all that basically it is. But the Internal Revenue Service now said they're coming up with a new form. Both forms are new and after the investigation has been made. We think they're getting into that pretty fast. They've also conducted a test in the last month of their own. As I understand it, they went into Birmingham, Alabama, and they looked into at 131 businesses, and found that about 79 of those cases were willing to accept, 69, 79, accept the cash. A lower figure, only about 60%, 90. But all they did was, as I said, go in and just look at the books. And you see, you don't have to report it if they are paid in a cashier's check or a money order. And when they looked on the books and they held cashier, they didn't count those. So their figures would be a little lower than ours. But both the Internal Revenue Service and our committee both agree that the rate of compliance is mighty low, almost nil.
I would think it would be very hard to correct because there are just so many businesses. I mean, you have to go to every store, not every store, but most every store that is capable of something like that has items that cost that much.
But you'd be surprised. Our committee suggested about 9 or 10 different cities. And we, in order to get a good spread throughout the country, I got a list of the cities, but we went into 9 different cities. But we did not tell the investigators who to call on, or what kind of business to call on, or how to go about it. They were trained. And they just picked out businesses at random. Businesses which would deal in luxury cars, or rugs, or even realty companies, antique shops, jewelry stores. And just at random. And just went off out the street into the businesses and asked them. Now they want to buy this, but they want to sell cash. And 76 out of 79 said, just give me that money talks. And they said, you got to put a name down, but give me any name. says, Mickey Mouse if you want to. And they said, and then when he got ready to leave, he said, well, Mr. Mickey, you come by tomorrow and we'll do some business with you.
Tonight we'll be talking about money laundering. Our guest is veteran Representative J.J. Pickle from Texas. He represents the 10th District, which includes the city of Austin, serving his 14th term. He's a member of the Ways and Means Committee and chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee. Also serves on the Health Subcommittee and the Joint Taxation Committee. We'll be taking your calls in just a few moments. The numbers will be listed throughout the show at the bottom of the screen, but we'll give them to you once here at the top. If you're calling from the Eastern or Central time zones, it's 202-628-2525. That's 202-628-2525. That's the number you use if you're calling from the Eastern or Central time zone. Now, if you're calling from the Mountain or Pacific time zones, it's 202-783-2727. That's 202-783-2727. And again, the 30-day policy, if you've called in within the last month, let's wait and give some other folks a chance to get through. Now, the businesses that you went to, the 76 out of the 79, have they been notified of this action or what went on or what's happening to them, if anything?
No, we have not notified them, and they didn't go back the next day and actually deliver the cash. But we have turned all that information over to the Internal Revenue Service, who have said that they will contact those businesses, as well as the attorneys who they say, some of the businesses said they had attorney on hire just to handle these kind of cases. So the information has been turned over to Internal Revenue Service.
Will the Drug Enforcement Agency get involved in this? Because do you assume that some of this money, not obviously the committees, but people are dealing in drug money?
They will not have a primary part in this part. They would if there was drug money. We conducted this investigation to see how businesses were handling their transaction. Some of it may be drug money, the source of it, we may find out later. But at this point, it's not a DAA operation. This is just an oversight. We wanted to know how is business being conducted in the country in these sales. And we were shocked to find out that they are just simply not obeying the law. I'd like to believe that most of them feel that it's really acceptable and it's part of the deal. Just go ahead and make the sale and everybody look the other way. But that's not the case. It represents a lot of money. You see a merchant who's dealing, who's not making a record of it. He's taking money that may not have never had any tax paid on it, and he's taking it cash, just like somebody give you a $100,000 check and you don't have to report it. That is evasion of tax. That hurts every good law-abiding taxpayer.
Let's go to the phones. Kingston, New York. You're on the air.
Yes, I have a question for you, Mr. Representative.
Yes, sir.
Okay, go right ahead. If you could speak up a little bit, you're a little bit low.
Why is it that the American people should allow you to raise your tax monies by drawing it from whatever means you can, when you as a government has shown the inability to manage the funds that you do receive?
Well, I guess that's a good question. They're not related to the problem. The salary we receive is one thing for the service we rendered the government. We are trying now to see that people comply with the law. Certainly when we get a check, we have to pay income on that. We're simply saying that if this is the law of the land, it should be enforced. Would you say that we should not enforce the law?
It's not that you should not enforce the law, but first of all, you should prove that you can manage the monies that you already receive from the law-abiding citizens.
Well, I guess, sir, that's what we're trying to prove here. We're trying to prove that we can prove our worth by carrying out the law and see that it is in law. And I hope that our enforcement agencies can prove that to you.
Go down to Birmingham, Alabama. You're on C-SPAN.
Thank you, sir.
Right ahead.
I have a question for Mr. Pickle. It seems to me, and I'm just an ordinary citizen, retired, it seems to me that we're focusing in on a segment of our citizenry that's almost an arm of the IRS in policing certain aspects of business transactions. We're already into that kind of facet in collecting sales tax and other taxes that we are required to do. And I parallel it with the proposition that the country of Rome, Italy has been in. They've had about 25 different governments over there, and probably the most underpaid taxes in the world is is in that country because of the taxation. And I just wonder if it didn't putting an undue burden on the citizenry, tax-paying people.
Well, they showed you this form 8300, and the Internal Revenue Service has said they're going to try to simplify that even more. And all we're saying is that if you do have a business transaction, it ought to be reported. All we're trying to find out is, are people paying their fair share of taxes? You see, we have a voluntary system, and if we don't collect taxes from the illegal operation, you and I and other law-abiding citizens are going to be paying more than our share. Now, I grant you that this is a form they'd have to fill out, and we ought to keep those to a minimum. And small businesses they're harassed constantly by having too many forms. So I recognize that. But I would think that if a business is being asked to fill out a form that wouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes, and he's dealing in a sale of an item that would be $50,000 to $100,000, that would not be much difficulty to fill out. So we do want to keep them at a minimum, but the only reason we're doing this is we're trying to get taxes so that the honest paying taxpayer will not have to pay the taxes for somebody else.
Palm Desert, California, you're on C-SPAN.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Pickle.
Heidi.
I like your program, C-SPAN, and also I am enjoying Mr. Pickle.
Thank
What
you.
I'd like to know, and that is why we don't have a more conform program for the people from foreign countries that are over here earning good money from our positions as far as offered by job intervention in this country, and they aren't paying their fair share of taxes. Is this part of our scam as far as laundering money? They get to send money home to Mexico, to Europe, Spain, whatever. We have ID numbers on our bank accounts, and we've got to pay taxes on it. Why don't they?
Well, they should, and we are looking into it. Listen, the problem of seeing that foreign citizens are paying their fair share, or that foreign businesses, is a very difficult problem for us. Let me give an example. My committee is the investigating committee, and we have now underway an investigation under what we call Section 482. That is the case where a foreign subsidiary owns a business in the United States, like, let's say, Japan. We always talk about Japan. They send automobile bills here, and through transfer pricing system, they'll charge a high price for it and send that money back to Japan or Germany or England or wherever it might be. We are losing literally billions of dollars because we're not collecting from those businesses the kind of taxes. We're losing that sum with respect to the employees that you mentioned. I hope we can do better. That's one of the things our committee is trying to look into. So you touched on a very timely matter, and I hope we can do better about it.
Go to Fairfax, Virginia. You're on the air.
Yes, good evening. I watch many hearings, Congressman Pickle, on C-SPAN. I watch yours today, as I've watched many others. And a thought struck me, and I'd like to convey it to you while I was watching the hearings. All I could think about was Neil Bush and the Silverado, what have you, the Alley North and Seacourt Enterprise, the Internal Revenue and their Gestapo tactics, and the HUD scandals and the S&L scandals, and the lobbyists who have made millions and millions of dollars, to say nothing about Ronald Reagan going to Japan and getting $2 million for whatever favor he might have done them. It's very difficult, Congressman, to get incited or excited about something that you are saying in this laundered money field. I understand it. I don't certainly agree with it. I do agree with it. But there are so many things in this country that are billions and trillions in destroying the country that this is not even a little piece of anything in the ocean.
Well, I don't know that we'd say this is a little drop in the ocean, because if we're actually losing some $30 billion in taxes that are not being paid, that's no small item. It is a bother, we'll say, to businesses, but we're asking business cooperation. Now, I can't comment or relate to these other matters you mentioned. Mr. Neil Bush's problem has been aired and is being aired, and he will be asking the courts and our judicial system to settle that, and that's where it ought to be. I'm speaking only with respect to the fact that I think we have a right to expect businesses to pay their taxes and not to deal under the table. Because when they do that, that hurts you and me and every law-abiding citizen.
Go down to Bartow, Florida. You're on the air.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pickle, I'm a little bit curious, but extremely dubious of your goals. If I understand what you're saying that if you can just get these people making illegal money to pay their fair share of taxes, then you won't be taking as much of my money? Is that what you're seriously saying?
No, not at all. We'll be collecting money from them, and not just you. You're paying the load of the federal government, and these other people are not paying their fair share. That's all I'm saying. You should pay whatever you earn and whatever you can't deduct, and what's left you pay tax on. That's all we're saying. That, and we're not saying you can't deal in cash. Just make a record of it, because there is a presumption that if you come in and say, I want to pay $50,000 for an automobile, that you don't want to make a record of that, and you don't want anybody looking into it, and you don't want them to report it to anybody, so it won't be known. Now, you surely can't condone that, and that's what we're trying to stop. So that's the purpose of our hearing, and we found out that in our investigation that this is true. And you know, the Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury and the Justice Department have all admitted yesterday at the hearing that we must put greater priority. In the time past, what they had been going after was the money launderer, the big fellow that had big satchel of money and we'd put it in the bank and nobody would ever know it. We haven't been looking at the merchants because we just didn't want to think that businesses were also doing this. Now, this doesn't mean that all merchants, but it's pretty much an indictment when 76 out of 79 said that we will deal with you. That doesn't speak very well for the business community per se.
I'd like to point out that the three businesses that didn't go along were a jeweler in New York City and a car dealer and another jeweler in Minneapolis.
Yeah, that's right. Three of them. And in the District of Columbia now, we're broadcasting from Washington, we found out this last year, up to now, that only 3 of these 8,300 forms have been filled out. 3 in the District of Columbia, meaning that there's nobody here, and that nobody bought a car over $10,000 and paid cash for it, or drugs, and as much of that going in place where only 3. That means it's a complete, this thing. Let me go further. In the case here involving a drug trafficker, in which was tried last year, Rayful Edmonds, our committee read the court records and went out and talked to the merchants based on the court proceedings and asked if they had made the reports. They said they had not filled out the reports that had been, of course, turned over to the Internal Revenue Service. They had not filled out these 8,300, and that it wasn't a matter of just failing to do it. They knew they were dealing with people in this kind of business, and yet we're not doing it. So here was a concrete evidence, and not just money that was verbally offered, but transaction that took place. And so it seems to me that here in Washington, D.C., as much as any place in the country, there's an almost complete disregard for filling out these forms. 3 of them only. You mean to tell me only 3 merchants in a metropolitan area of 4 million people didn't sell any items over $10,000 in cash? Come on, that's not a fact.
Go to Santa Rosa, California. You're on the air.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Pickle.
Yes, sir. How are you, sir?
Oh, just fine, and yourself?
Good.
I have just a couple of statements that I'd like to make, and then also to be followed up by one question. Now, it's obvious we do need an Internal Revenue Service in this country, and we do need to collect taxes. The situation as far as some of the imports that we bring in, it seems to me that could make up a big chunk of the, I wouldn't want to quote you on the $30 billion, but somewhere within there that you stated, that would make up quite a big portion, if not much more. Also, the fact of privacy between business and a personal transaction, it would seem to me that somebody doing this transaction would already reported their money to, if it, if such a legal earnings, to the IRS. Now, if in fact 76 out of 79 businesses and also the what I've heard from personal statements from people on the show so far, doesn't it seem that Congress, being we the people, representing the people, it sounds to me like the law should be changed.
Yes. We have made some suggestions yesterday to the enforcement agencies in 3 or 4 different areas. One, the law now says that if you don't report this money over $10,000, you can be fined 10% of the transaction. We're recommending as a committee, or I think we will, that that percentage ought to be raised to 100, because a 10% on it is not much. It just doesn't amount to anything. We're making recommendations that says that if an individual in a store connives with the purchaser to fill out these forms, that they are party to the transaction. They are co-conspirators, so to speak, and that would be against the law. We're making a recommendation that says that if you deal in cash, you must count money orders or cashier checks. When we passed the law, originally we said that cash meant cash or currency. It did not include money orders. That is a loophole. In some of the cases here, particularly the Rayful Edmonds case here, we had one fellow that bought an automobile for $78,000, and there were about 10 different transactions. All but one were on cashier's check. That doesn't count because that was not included in the definition. So we think a definition should be changed. Now those are just 3 examples of the type of changes we think should be made, and maybe there should be more. And the enforcement agencies indicated that they would consider that very seriously and probably endorse it.
Let's go up to Salem, New Jersey. You're on the air.
This is me.
Go right ahead.
Hi. I would like to ask the gentleman about the SNL scandal, and I understand that the FICA is also in trouble. The senators and the congressmen are supposed to be monitoring this. The bankers are supposed to be honorable, and at the same time, the American taxpayer is going to wind up paying for this. Why hasn't it been monitored? Why does the American taxpayer have to pay for the mistakes of people that are supposed to be taking care of this?
Well, they should have been monitored more closely, and I think we would all recognize that. They are being monitored now. We have dozens of suits being filed over the country now where we think fraud has been involved. And those people ought to be prosecuted and ought to be put in jail behind the bars because they have fleeced the people and honest people out of it. I think that the government is trying to play catch-up on it. I think we had lax regulation. We deregulated them at a time perhaps when we shouldn't have. But the fact of the matter is that we didn't follow them as close as we could. Now, a lot of the credit, the blame can be put in different places. The cold fact of the matter is that it has happened. And what the government is trying to do now is simply trying to protect the financial system of the United States so it won't go into collapse. And I think that we must do that. As unpleasant as it is, I think it has to be done. And I hope we can do more monitoring, as you say, on these kind of cases in the future.
Next call is from Texas. Houston, you're on the air.
Thank you. Mr. Pickle?
Yes?
I'm a young entrepreneur, and one of my things that my concern is, I do believe fully that as far as 10,000 or so should be reported, but isn't going to the small businesses now just a solution? Because the small businesses are the backbone of the country, and we seem always as the problem or the solution, let's get to the small businesses. And this has been done at city, this has been done at state and federal.
Well, I would say to you that this is one more form of small business, but I don't think any small business should object just simply filling out a form if they receive a cash payment of over $10,000 or $20,000, $30,000. That is not an imposition. Let me tell you, if you go into a clothing store or department store and you make a purchase, whether it's for clothing or refrigerator, whatever it is, you have to, you will take a customer's credit card, won't you? I presume all merchants do, and all you get from that card is their name and their address and information that's on the driver's license. You're asked that almost every time you make a purchase. Now, we're asking less information on this item where there may be $50,000 to $100,000 involved in a cash payment. And that's all we were asking. So, yes, it is another form, but it is not being imposed on just small business. It's on any business. We picked out only those cases that were generally classified as luxury items, and that's why we've chosen to go that route.
Bend, Oregon is next.
Hello.
Hello. Go right
Good
ahead.
evening.
I would like to ask Representative Pickle. Now, they're after these businesses, and he thinks it's terribly unfair that businesses are not admitting to every penny they take in and paying taxes on it.
No, not every penny. We're talking about purchases that are in excess of $10,000 in cash. So not just every penny.
All right, but I would like to ask you how you feel about the 1986 what is the name of it?
Well, the Tax Reform Act.
The Tax Reform Act. Now, in the 1986 Tax Reform Act, and I have this all in black and white here in front of me if you're not familiar with it, but in Texas, there was written into that Tax Reform Act, and this is only one of the many, many things that were written into there, to give private people, friends of our Congress, tax breaks.
I didn't hear you that now.
I think you mentioned there were tax breaks in the law.
All right, can I read you this?
No, I don't want you to read it because we have a lot of calls waiting. But do you have a specific question regarding the subject?
Yes,
of the,
I want to know why Geraldine Ballard, friend of Jim Wright, it was written into the tax code that her estate was escaped the payment of $4 million.
All right, ma'am,
taxes.
That's not really anything to do, as far as I can see, or Congressman, can you relate that to this?
No, and I'm not familiar with that. But let me say this. Whatever you're going to read me, I would like to say that that's not correct. There's not a more honorable man in the United States than former Speaker Jim Wright, and I regret that he got brought into it. Now, if you would write me that particular incident that you have reference to, I'd try to give you a direct response on it, but I'm not familiar with what you're going to claim.
Go to Chicago for our next call.
Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Yeah. I'm a Hispanic, and I got some Palestinian friends, and they got a small business in Chicago, and they send a small amount, they send some of the money slowly to Jordan, and then they bring the whole amount, all the money they send, they bring the full amount back to the United States. I assume if the Palestinians are doing that, maybe some other people from different countries are doing that to clean the money and get away with the taxes. If there's anything they can do about that?
Oh, I don't know that practice is going on. If it is going on, we ought to try to put a stop to it as best we can. If you have any evidence or facts that you know of where this is taking place and not being apprehended, if you let me know or any of us know, we'll try to have that looked into.
Let's go to York County, Indiana. You're on C-SPAN.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. You were talking about the Aller North and Poindexter and so forth, and a special prosecutor to investigate them and so forth, and that everybody should be, no one should be above the law. I'm looking at an amendment here that was submitted to the Omnibus Crime Bill 5269 to investigate any member of Congress that had been involved with savings and loan and so forth. And Jack Brooks and his committee rejected any investigation of members of Congress or past members of Congress that have been involved, such as Jim Wright, Tony Coelho, and so forth. Why wouldn't the democratically controlled Judiciary Committee let them investigate all the people and let the chips fall where they may?
All right, that's a little bit off the subject. Would you like to care to
Yes,
comment on that?
That's off the subject, and that is a self-serving type of question. the Congress simply didn't use a Judiciary Committee just to serve as a witch hunt against anybody who might have had anything to do with it. The accusations against them were just allegations, no facts of wrongdoing. If they were, then they ought to be prosecuted, or anybody should. But that is a rather self-serving question, has nothing to do with this issue.
Let's go to Phoenix, Arizona. You're on the air.
Yes, after watching the program on C-SPAN the other day, and after watching another program in which the senators were talking about the selling arms to some of the third world countries, I kind of came to the conclusion that they're dealing with a double standard and looking at big business versus small business. The reason I say that is that many of the senators and bureaucrats who were involved in selling arms to the third world countries indicated that they did so because if we didn't do it, somebody else would. And I think that's the same attitude that many of the small businessmen have in relationship to selling goods and not reporting these cash sales, is that the only thing that the small businessman is going to do is be out the sale. The guy's going to go down the street and buy it from somebody else. And
Thanks, Phoenix.
Yeah, I didn't get the question. Thank you very much.
Basically, the question was if the merchant was taking the money because if he didn't, the next guy down the street would.
Well, you can hardly condone that in law. If that's the case, then nobody pays income tax because somebody else wouldn't have to pay it, and I think that's that would bring the country down fast. What we ought to say is that we've got a voluntary system, and everybody's supposed to pay their fair share based on their income. And if you're making income and not reporting it, then you're violating the law. And we're not talking about little peanuts. We're talking about $10,000 and above. When you go in to buy a condominium, as they did here in Washington, and you're willing to pay $250,000 in cash, and the realty company says, but you deal with me and I can work it out where we won't have to report it. Now, that's terribly wrong for merchants to do that. And I think the temptation is for us to say, well, you're bothering small business, and you ought to let this alone because we got to make a living, and because if we don't do it, they're going to buy it from somebody else. That simply is not defensible in law, and that would be defeating this country.
Has it been argued that it's an invasion of privacy?
No, nobody's asked for that, but really all these forms ask is for their name and their address and the amount of money that's involved in the description of the property. There's no privacy invasion on that.
Okay. Let's go up to Baltimore, Maryland. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. How are you today?
Okay.
Great.
You know, you're talking about everybody should pay their fair share. You're talking about merchants should report cash transactions in excess of $10,000. I've talked to my senators and congressmen, and they say that what I'm saying is absolutely not true. They don't believe it. They'll look into it, but they never get back to me and let me know what they have found out. I know it to be a fact because I've talked to the Korean and the business people that come over here and open up businesses. If I start a business, I'm responsible to pay corporate income taxes, or I'm responsible to pay personal income taxes, or any type of business taxes that are due, sales taxes, things of that sort. But yet, my understanding from the Korean community is that when they buy a business, the first 5 years that they are in business, they do not have to pay any kind of taxes at all, whether it's Social Security taxes, federal taxes, state taxes, sales taxes. At the end of 5 years, they turn around and they then turn their business over or sell their business to somebody else in the Korean community. Therefore, they do not have to pay any taxes. They don't withhold.
Let me just jump in here. Are you familiar with that? Any type of?
No, I'm not. If they're doing business over here as an entity, then they ought to be paying taxes. Here again, it's not on this particular subject, but if you'd write me, I would ask that be looked into. Would you do that?
Okay, we'll have the address up on the screen at least one more time. Let's go down to Fort Walton Beach, Florida. You're our last call for tonight.
Good afternoon.
Good evening.
I think possibly the congressman may have missed the entire point that the taxpayers are fed up with the excessive taxes that we are subject to. I'm the most penny-pinching person you have ever seen. I sell my aluminum cans. I buy cheap shaving cream, and I only buy items on sale. I waste nothing. But while I'm being conservative and watching my pennies, an incompetent Congress and a worthless administration has just laid a $5,000 debt on my wife and myself because of the savings and loan debacle. I now owe, thanks to my government, an extra $5,000 to an incompetent government.
All right, let me just jump in here. Again, that is off the subject, but if you'd like to comment.
Well, it's not off the subject, because he feels the wrath of a lot of people do of the country that the savings loan is going to cost a lot of people, you and your wife, over the years. And that is essentially true. The basic question is, though, that we've got to try to save the financial system. This has happened, and in some cases it was fraud, in some cases it was just poor business judgment, in some cases it was just bad luck that the savings loan had gone under. It's a combination. It did happen. We did deregulate, and we let them get into business that wasn't strictly the housing or the savings loan operation. It happened. So the question is, what do we do? Now, this particular subject we're talking about today is not connected to that. I think we all must admit that there's some blame or criticism on about this S&L. Nobody should deny that, but it has happened, and we've got to now see it through the best way we can. We hope and pray that the Resolution Trust Corporation, working with the FDIC, can help us find a way to take this property and move the assets so that people who have put their money in banks won't lose that money, and that we can go forward as a strong nation. That's going to take money, and that's going to take a penalty a lot of people. And some of you may be one of them. We all are. But we all work together, and we're just one country. Now, I want to say this before you go off the air on this particular thing, this case. The Oversight Subcommittee of the Ways and Means Committee is simply charged to look into these cases where we think people are not paying their share, or whether we're giving too much credit, or where credit should be taken back. We're simply trying to make it as fair as possible. It's a difficult matter, and it's difficult for the Internal Revenue Service to actually always be fair. One person said it's not exactly a fair system. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you question, how can this person get by not paying any tax and somebody pays so heavy? And those are kind of questions that there's just no real clear answer to. But in this particular question, the law says that if you engage in transactions where there's over $10,000 in cash, it should be reported. That's true of banks, and that's true of businesses. That's the law, and surely we must all say that we've got to put some priority on these kind of cases. I think the Internal Revenue Service and the Justice Department said yesterday that they're going to do that, and I would hope this would serve as a notice to the business community that all we're asking in these kind of cases is simply fill out a form if they're involved in cases in over 10,000. That's all. It ought to be a relatively simple matter, and nobody should object to it. We're not doing it because we've just accepted it as a matter of course. They don't have to do it, and so therefore we're going to do it, and we're going to cut the corner. But we're losing a lot of money, and all these people who complain about what government has done, I would think they would say, that's right, we ought to collect money if transactions take place. And that's all our committee is trying to do.
Representative J.J. Pickle, Democrat of Texas, thanks very much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
We'll be back in a moment with Ralph Nader for another Live Viewer Call-In. Back in a minute.
Any money for these things? Well, our committee has given us figures based on some of the Internal Revenue estimates that we may be losing as much as $30 billion a year just by failure to pay taxes on these cash transactions.
Is the committee moving to correct that?
Well, we have made some suggestions at the hearing yesterday to the Internal Revenue Service and the Justice and the Treasury Department. We have given them 3 or 4 suggestions where we think corrections can be made. I think in general they are willing to endorse those changes, and they're also willing to make some investigations of their own. For instance, within the last month now, the Internal Revenue Service has devised a new form. The form we use now is 8300. And that's all the merchant's supposed to fill out. I've got an 8300 here. This is an 8300 form now. Just a simple form that says give me the name and the address, and the amount of money that's involved, and the name and address of the seller. That's about all that basically it is. But the Internal Revenue Service now said they're coming up with a new form. Both forms are new one after the investigation has been made. We think they're getting into that pretty fast. They've also conducted a test in the last month of their own. As I understand it, they went into Birmingham, Alabama, and they looked into at 131 businesses, and found that about 79 of those people.
Representative J.J. Pickle of Texas, your subcommittee recently did a study showing that some American businessmen are willing to launder money. Why?
Well, presumably because they don't want a record made of the cash transaction and, in effect, not paying the taxes on that as income. Years ago, the Congress passed a law that first made money laundering illegal. And then we amended it by Section 6050I that said that business must report these kind of cash transactions. And the law says that if any merchant or institution is receiving cash in excess of $10,000, that must be reported to the Internal Revenue Service. So we are asking the merchants, the business people of the country, to simply fill out a form that if someone comes and wants to buy a luxury item from them, that all they got to do is make a report of it, their name and their address, basic information. So we had some investigators go out the last couple of months into 9 different cities in 9 different states and offered to buy these items, Persian rugs and automobiles and condominiums, watches and that type of thing, and always said we'd want to pay in cash. That was the only way we'd have it, and we wanted to know, would that be reported? We would find out that they would take the cash and not report it. It was a rather shocking thing to realize that in 79 different businesses that the investigators went into, 76 said that they would take the cash and not report it. 76 out of 79 said, give me the cash and I'll not fill out this form.
Did that number surprise you, that many were willing to do it?
Not only surprised us, it has shocked us to realize that approximately 95% of the businesses in the country are willing to make a sale and not report it. Now you ask yourself, well, did they know it? Did they know the law? In most cases, they indicated that they knew there was a money laundering law, had something to do with the drug traffic. But they would also go a step further to say that we think you could get around this law by giving us cashier checks or structuring the sale in a manner that they wouldn't have to make a record of it. In other words, they knew what the law was in most instances, but simply were willing to circumvent the law.
Now, do you assume that most of the money we're talking about here is money from illegal operations?
No, we can't assume that. We know that if an individual, a money launderer, go to a bank by virtue of the law we passed in Congress, they must make that report to the Internal Revenue Service. It's called a CTR, Currency Transaction Reform Act. They're doing that. They weren't doing it years ago, the banks, until our investigators went into Atlanta, Georgia, at a jewelry store, I believe it was. And they said, yes, we can sell these items. We think we can work with you. They said, as a matter of fact, the Internal Revenue Service has been looking at some of our books, wondering if we are engaging in these kind of transactions. Says, actually, at this very minute, there's a couple of them in the back of our store now checking our books. And if you don't mind, he said, lower your voices just a little bit so they won't hear what we're talking about. Now he said, we can get around the law this way. Now that's shocking. So it's one of our members said it's the most shocking revelation that he has seen since his 12 to 15 years in the Congress.
Should I assume that you suspected this trend and that's why you did the study?
Yes, we knew that it was happening in the banking institutions, and we assumed that it was done So we set out to find. We just simply ran a test. Now, we didn't try to entrap anybody. We just simply went out to these merchants. We had two people, a man and a woman, good, capable investigators, and went in and said they want to buy all these items, and they looked at them, and then they offered them the cash, or to give them the cash. No money was actually transacted. And the merchants would always say, well, either we can't do it, and as they get ready to leave, they said, but just a minute, I think we can help you work around your problem this way. So it seems to me like it's a sort of a accepted procedure that businesses are following, and that hurts everybody. And you say, well, or you really lose. We had a case up in Boston where the Justice Department brought a suit and got a conviction, and all at once the banks and the savings loan found religion. They began to fill out these forms. Now, we're asking individuals to do that now to help their government to know, and we're not trying to keep them from involving in cash sales, but if they do over $10,000, and here's why we do it. If a person comes into you and say, I want to buy something for an automobile of $50,000, but I only pay it in cash, there is a presumption that that cash is coming from some source, perhaps hadn't paid tax on it, and that you're willing to take it as a sale and not pay tax on it. And you are then hurting all taxpayers when you do that. So that is really an invasion of the law. But merchants are willing to do it because I think it's just been the accepted thing to do. And nobody has followed out to change it. And so it was a shocking, it really is a disgrace that our businesses have allowed this to develop to this point.
Historically, at least when we hear about drug cases where this has come up before, we think of luxury items, as you mentioned, cars and watches and some other things. But when you talk about, I think it was an antique shop also was willing to do it, that kind of surprised me.
Well, antique items are usually expensive items, and many of them are over the $10,000 mark. But merchants are willing to say, give me the cash. It got so bad in some cases that they knew something about it. Give an example.